The splash, yeah. Unclick that from splash timer. That one, you need to plug that back in. That one's dead. You're going to have to use this one. I'm going to use my phone. Plug that one back in.
One pulpit.
I don't know.
One in the middle.
Nah, I don't like that. I want my own.
My own.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have
Good
audio.
morning. Do we have audio?
I don't have any. You're
I'm not hearing the speaker.
It's not you. Hello. This. All right.
Now we got audio. Okay, folks, time for Sunday school. Whew. You gonna be able to handle it on your?
Yeah.
Your eyes are better than mine.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about the title of the Sunday school is Filthy Rich. We're going to talk. We want to have a discussion on wealth and what that means from a scriptural standpoint. This term, filthy rich, is actually comes from the English translation of the Bible done by Tyndale, where he translated greedy gain would be kind of the literal translation of the term to filthy lucre was the way he translated that in the Tyndale translation.
Right.
And Tyndale had a tremendous impact on Bible translations. He introduced a number of phrases and even invented words that didn't exist in the English language, and those made their way into the King James Bible, which is largely based on Tyndale's translation, and now we have them here. So we have words that we use all the time, even to this modern day, that Tyndale made up. He just invented words because they didn't have the words they needed to do it. And so one of those terms that he put in as his translation was filthy lucre, and that became filthy rich. And there's a number of passages where that is translated that way. You got 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, 1 Peter 5. They all have that term filthy lucre. And nowadays we use the term filthy rich differently than what filthy lucre meant in the Bible. And yet we find that there's still vestiges, there's still a certain amount of flavor left over from how that term was originally used after the Bible translation, which the idea is that people who have inordinate amounts of money, lots of money, they're filthy rich. So you got rich people, then you have the filthy rich people. They have extreme amounts of money, and we call that filthy riches. And nowadays it's less, how would you put it?
Connected.
Well, it's less mean. It's not, we don't always use it like a derogatory term, but it can be. Anyways, the reason why we wanted to talk about this is because it does come from a underlying mindset that having a lot of money in some way is dirty. That if you have a reasonable amount of wealth, and all these words are already, obviously geared to that bias. But if you have a reasonable amount of wealth, that's okay. But if you have an unreasonable, if you have a lot more wealth than anybody else, like 1,000 times more, or 10,000, or 1,000,000 times more than anyone else, well then somehow that's dirty in and of itself. And so this is the issue that we wanted to talk about.
Okay, and this is really sort of a term that is used, though, in socialist propaganda, the filthy rich. And this is actually an attempt to establish some form of class warfare within a socialist framework, so that you can set up someone and say, we are not them, they're different than us, they're not just wealthy, they are filthy rich. And it resonates a lot, doesn't it, with kind of the average person who looks at themselves and says, I'm not wealthy. And this message of the filthy rich and the class division seems to resonate with a lot of people who see themselves that way.
Okay. So I would tell you that there is a visceral and intuitive attraction to socialism itself. There's a reason why, despite all evidence of what the results of socialism is, it constantly is very, very popular. There's a reason for this, and that's because it taps into this very visceral, intuitive thinking. In fact, I find it interesting because, I mean, I have to remember that and Terry is there to help me remember this. She reminds me, right? I read on this stuff constantly. This is like the biggest subject I read. I read all sorts of books on this, on economics and stuff. And so I have a tendency to think that everyone sees it how I see it, or views it the way I view it. But what I find so interesting to me is that I'll have many of my friends who are nominally capitalists, let's say, right, who all the time espouse socialist ideas. It's just all the time. It's not big things. It's not like, hey, vote for a socialist or anything like that. But you'd be surprised, even maybe some of you, how socialistic you actually are in your thinking in many, many ways. Because it is a very intuitive way of thinking. It makes sense just intuitively. It's just it's like in the background noise of our thought process. Capitalism there's a reason it took so long to develop. It's not intuitive. It is completely anti-intuitive. Completely anti-intuitive. And so socialism has that let's say that virtue, that it just makes sense off the bat. Now, comes to find out, there's a lot of problems with it, and I think that what is intuitively what we would call common sense. I'm not a big proponent of common sense. I don't want a politician with common sense. I don't like it. I don't like the term common sense. I think it's really silly because I think all the sense that's common among the population, not very good.
Yeah.
Right? I want somebody with uncommon sense.
Right.
In socialism, it really does fit many times common sense, and you figure out something's wrong with it when you start researching and you start figuring some things out unintuitively. Right?
Okay, so let me ask this question. Why do you think socialism is so attractive? And what part of socialism do you see in our society today? Aaron. Oh, but will you get a mic?
Yeah,
Please.
you need to use a mic if you to participate, please. You guys can just grab some of these if you want. We don't need to leave them up there.
On the stand.
So if you guys want to grab a mic and just hold on to it, pass it around, that works. Just pull it off. Just yank it off. There you go.
I think it's so attractive because people think that they want it to be fair, they want stuff to be free, and socialism seems for everything to be free, because that's just first glance until you look deeper into it, and a lot of people don't want to look deeper into it. They just they don't have enough interest into it. They just see, oh, it's free, cool, that's fun.
Okay.
I think that's why it's so attractive.
So things being free, everything being free, and a lot of equality, right? Just pull it right off. Just jerk it off. It pops right out of that.
I think that the concept, though, for like the lazy man, that makes it extremely interesting because it's like, oh, I don't have to work, and all the work that you do, I get that. But if they're not taking the cheap way out for looking at why it is not a bad idea, like because it really does level playing fields. Like some people, they work really hard and what they do just doesn't make very much in the society. Or other people, they don't work very hard, but where they landed, fortunately, they're really prosperous. Or like sometimes you make a crop and it doesn't work, and like his crop next door did work. And if you leveled that out, like even the Lord kind of has that concept when you're gathering manna. It's like he who gathers too much, like is not going to gather too much. Who gathers too little will have enough. And ideally that'd be beautiful. The reason like why I'd say that isn't as attractive is because of corrupt humanity. People take advantage of the system. But in ideal, like socialism as an ideal seems beautiful. It's like, oh, everybody has exactly what they need. The one who was able to get more takes care of the ones who weren't able to get as much. But that assumes that everybody's trying their best to accomplish things, which corrupt humanity doesn't do.
Very good. Yes, sir.
I've heard socialists also argue that that Christ's teachings were socialism, and that the kingdom of heaven ultimately would be a socialist society.
Right.
Yes, that is true. I mean, the teachings of Jesus are often used as proof texts for socialist ideas.
Yes.
Absolutely, and as well as the Book of Acts and the Apostles and the first church. All that is often used as proof texts of socialism. That is true. That is true. It's true that happens, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm not
Right.
advocating for it, but
Would you consider like
you gotta get right up on it.
would you consider like 501c3s and donations and nonprofits a form of socialism, and that's what's so appealing to other people?
Actually, I don't consider any of that a form of socialism at all. I consider that to be a form of the Book of Acts, where people, out of their own will, with no coercion, no pressure, no violence, gave to help others. And I'm all in favor of that. Capitalism is built on the concept of that, actually, of helping others out of voluntary transactions. So all of those 501c's, charitable giving, nonprofit organizations, that all, in my opinion, falls under the umbrella of what Acts was really about, which was individuals helping others.
Did you have something?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that, especially in Europe, I can see why it was so popular, because for so long they had these like hardcore monarchies that just, and these like huge class divisions for like such a long period of time. Like, it makes sense why it seems so appealing, and it's a very appealing idea. Like, in general, all about it is appealing, especially for like countries that have been through that.
Yes, I think that's a very good insight. There is some. So when we deal with socialism, I think it's important that we not vilify something based on, because we hear socialism. Oh, as Americans, we kind of have a reaction against it historically, and the polls show that. And we ought to be careful. We ought to really know what it is we're talking about when we're discussing it. And I think there's many people in the country who hate socialism, and yet they don't know what it is they're actually hating. And so, yes, you're right. There are elements of socialism and that's my point, that they just feel right. Don't you want to help the poor? Don't you want things to be more equal? Don't you want to take away the class divisions? Don't you want to have everyone be the brotherhood of man? Doesn't all that sound great? And if you're honest, you say, yeah, that all sounds wonderful. Absolutely. And they say, well, that's what we want to do. And let me give you a very, very quick primer of what socialism is. So Marx comes up with this idea that everybody was going to receive what they needed, and everyone was going to pay according to their ability. That's the basic premise of Marxism, right?
Which sounds a lot like that he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who didn't have enough received what they needed from the guy who gathered too much.
You're going to get what you need, and you're going to pay as according to your ability. And that's the basic premise of Marxism. How do you achieve that? Especially looking at it's developed in Europe, where there's this huge class divisions and limit of opportunity. How are you going to achieve that, right? And so the way that it goes about is say we're going to start with socialism, which is where the government is going to impose this. This is a very simplified version, but the government is going to impose this ideal on the people. And by, it will have been imposed for a sufficient amount of time that it will be adopted and it'll just be part of the culture. And then government can go away, and we will transition to communism, where there is no government, and people just voluntarily take according to their need and pay according to their ability. No country has ever made the transition. Russia was never communist. It was always socialist. In fact, that's its name, right? USSR is Socialist Soviet Republic. No country has ever made it to communism. They can never cross that barrier between the government imposing it and people voluntarily doing it, which would be communism. So that's kind of what we're talking about. But the ideas we often refer to in these economic and financial and social, you got to remember, socialism is not just a financial concept. Very important. Socialism is a social concept.
Right.
and has huge social ramifications. Okay?
And,
All right,
and
go ahead.
since psychologists, or since we as human beings are inherently social creatures, we have this idea of social relationships built into our psychology, and therefore this concept of socialism actually has a deep appeal to certain parts of our psychology that are based upon our need to have social relationships with other people and how we think society ought to be, especially the concept of equality and justice in society.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I want to ask you a question. Let's look at this. When do you think there was a greater difference between the richest people and the average people in the world? In the history of the world, when do you think there is a greater difference in wealth between the richest people and the average people?
Older history, like monarchies.
Okay, why?
Because, like, even if you look at, like, how most of Europe was, especially back in history, it was like so many people were wealthy, and then there's a huge class division, and everyone else just like worked for them, like for the longest time.
Like under feudalism.
Yes, yeah, that's
Right.
when I think there's the biggest
But when
difference.
we look at the wealth difference, like if you look at, for instance, Bezos today, and you, financially, just in the numbers, there's a far bigger difference between you and Bezos than there would have been you and the monarch.
That's true.
Oh yeah.
Oh, certainly.
I wouldn't think that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Because we have this idea of this opulent king, when in reality they were often completely broke, and they were many of the wars they fought were because they were pressured to by their creditors.
Right.
Kings lived in debt many times. Very common.
I would say you would want a large distance between the very, very rich and the very, very poor, because that makes more people in the middle.
Well, that's true. But the question is, when do you think there was a greater difference? And my point here is that there's different ways of looking at that, right? Today, we're fed a narrative that there is a greater difference, as I pointed out, between the wealthiest and the average person than ever. The rich are getting richer and richer and richer, and the difference is getting greater, and that's where this whole idea of income inequality comes from, this whole notion that somehow the rich are getting rich at the expense of the average person, and this huge, and there is a monumental difference between the wealthiest people in the world today and you and I. It is a difference that you and I can't fathom, right?
That's right.
And yet at the same time, if we look at it in a different way, there's less difference between you and the richest person in the world than there ever has been in that situation in history. Put yourself in this thing. Imagine you walk in a room, and in the room, 400 years ago, sits the richest person in the world and an average person. Do you think if you walked in that room, you could tell who was who? I think you would know right off the bat. Right off the bat, you would know. You just walk in. You have no idea who they are. You just walk in out of nowhere. You don't know who they are, but it's the richest person and the average person, and you could look at their teeth. You could look at their clothes, right? You could see just on their face, the poor man would look old and haggard. The rich man would look plump. The poor man would be emaciated and thin. The rich man would be fat or healthy. I mean, it would be an immediate. Now imagine today, you walk in and Mark Zuckerberg is in the room and an average person is in the room. Do you think you could tell who the richest person in the room is?
No, I think now we have the same opportunities to get, I mean, basically anything. I mean, yeah, I can't go buy a boat, but I can take care of, like you're saying, my health, and I can buy basically the same things that they have. I mean, we just kind of have a level of opportunity that we can still have very similar things.
Not just, and I would say it's true, and I would add, not just opportunity.
That's right.
So the rich man has clothes and you have clothes. They often wear the exact same clothes you wear. They wear a hoodie, you wear a hoodie. It's not like the rich are walking around with a gold crown on their head. No, they could, I guess, if they wanted, but the point is when you walk in such a room, you would often not be able to distinguish who the wealthiest man is and who it is. They have access to dental care, so do you. They have access, they get their hair cut by professionals, and so do you. They, you know, about 400 years ago, you would tell who the wealthy man was, right? Because he would have transportation. He would have people carrying him around. And you would be walking. But not anymore. Or you would be the one carrying him, right? Not anymore. You say, well, he can buy a car that can go 250 miles an hour. But he drives the same road you do and he can only go 60. Yeah. Just like you. When you go down the highway, can you really tell the difference between who's rich and who's not? No. You can tell the difference between who's in debt and who's not often, right? My point isn't that rich people don't have access to more things. My point is that the fundamental difference between the average person today and the richest person today is inconsequential in almost all aspects. We often think, well, the rich people can afford things that we need, and we can't afford them. That actually isn't true.
Right.
You get medical attention whether you can afford it or not.
That's right.
And just as good.
That's right. And I think there's even a step beyond that, and that is that, like, more than anything else, more than cell phones and dental care and health care and clothing and all that, more than all of that, we actually all have this, and this is the most incredible thought. This marks us as different than anywhere else ever in history. We all have exactly the same access to building wealth. There is no dividing line that says that some people who have the right name or the right lineage can actually build wealth into their life. But if you don't have one of those names or any of that lineage, then there's no possible way for you to become wealthy in this society. It used to be that way, right? In those days that you were talking about in time past, especially under feudalism, where if you were a serf or a servant, you had no opportunity to build wealth. There was no place for you to invest. There was no place for you to safely store money. You simply didn't have access to capital and wealth the way we do today. In fact, I would make the argument that today we have almost an incredible amount of disposable income, right? Look at some of the, what do we mean by disposable income? Maybe you got an idea? What is disposable income? Yeah.
More than you need to meet your needs.
More than you need to meet your need. And think about the number of, I mean, this is funny in our day, but think about how many disposable things we buy with our disposable income, right? How much money have you spent on masks this year? Okay. All right, but think about all the other things people tend to use their disposable income for, right? How many of us have been, like, to the theater, right? And we go to the theater in our life. In fact, most of the time now, we don't even need to go to the theater. The very best shows are available to you in your living room, right? I mean, we don't have that. And we have this disposable income. We can pay monthly. We can sign up for a monthly subscription to get services delivered to our home on our whim, on our demand. We live in a demand-oriented society with more disposable income and hence more ability to build wealth than ever before.
I think that this is a critical point, just as even as an aside financially for all of us here. We can cry and complain about our lack of wealth, but wealth has to be built. And you and I have more opportunity, like Mike was saying, to build wealth, not just personal wealth, but intergenerational wealth than ever before. You can invest in anything the richest person in the world can invest. You can buy shares in the same company with almost no money. There's apps out there like one called Robinhood where you can buy fractional shares. You don't have to come up with $10,000 to buy a Bitcoin. You can buy $1 of Bitcoin. You can buy $2 of Apple. And if you would have bought that in March, right now it would have gone up about 30-fold. So if you would have put $100 in March, right now you'd have what? 30 times, you'd have $3,000. So we have these opportunities. That in it of itself is wealth. That's the opportunity that Kelly mentioned in what she had in her comment. That is wealth. We have tremendous opportunities. You have the opportunity right now, and I've said this before, some of you have new children. I would seriously encourage you to consider this. If you would take a couple $1,000, scrape it together, put it in a Roth IRA, in a mutual fund, and the kid's name, when they hit 65, they'll almost be millionaires. If you never added to it, if you put in, instead of an elaborate birthday, a little cheapy birthday and put the money in the IRA for him, your kid retires a multimillionaire.
Okay, but is that true right now? Do you really think that if these elections go like we don't want, or I don't want, I don't know about the rest
the
of
way
you.
Megan doesn't want, apparently.
I mean, if things go and this country starts turning socialist, would that still be true? I mean, things are.
I think that it would be.
Yes, because, and here's the thing, we have always lived under this shadow of the next election could turn the country in a bad direction. My parents talked like that. My grandparents thought that thought. It has always been there, and yet the economy has still grown because by and large, for the most part, capitalism is so strongly built into the American system that it would really take a revolution to drive it out. And even if, let's say it's not $1 million, let's say socialism sort of takes over a little bit in our society. There's already a little bit of socialism in our society and in various public care programs and things like that. But let's say it really took over and that money still grew, but it grew at a slower rate. Any growth that happens in that money is a better opportunity for your child to be wealthy at retirement than somebody who doesn't do that very same thing. If they taxed Roth IRAs, which I can't imagine them doing, but let's assume that they began to tax no-load mutual funds in a Roth IRA over time, it still would be growing far better than the pace of the economy would grow. If the economy goes down and you're invested in anything that lives long, and any mutual fund that's managed even somewhat competently changes itself to match the economy, to do better than the economy, you're still building wealth intergenerationally. And that's the key. There are things you can do now that would might not make you retire wealthy, but they would make your children be able to retire wealthy.
I would put it in this way to you, and I held off on investing for a long time for similar ideas. But here's how I would try to say to you as succinctly as possible, is that this is to be like the man in Proverbs that says he doesn't go out in the street because he's afraid there might be a lion there. Now, there might be a lion, right? There might be devastation in the future. But we can't make decisions today based on what might happen if something happened. In the case of something else happening, we can't decide like that. We have to make our decisions based on the information we actually have now, not the what-ifs and the fears of tomorrow.
Did you have something, Megan?
It was just the IRA, Roth. That's where they taxed you before?
Yes.
Yes.
You pay tax on your money, stick it in the IRA, and then when you take it out at retirement age, there's no tax on it. If you look into that, it is an incredible opportunity that is not available to the wealthy. We live in a time, and this goes back to our point, you as a poor person, if you want to call yourself, I don't think any of you are poor, but let's just pretend. You as a poor person have more opportunities, not fewer.
Will you describe what you're describing? She wasn't on the mic.
Oh, she asked me what a Roth IRA is. A Roth IRA is, there's two types of IRA. One is you deduct You get to deduct the money from your taxes, right? And you put it in, and then you pay taxes on all the money, including what it generates in profit or in interest when you retire. So normally you're paying that interest, you're paying that taxes at a lower rate. Because when you retire, your income goes down, and so your tax rate goes down is the idea. So you're deferring your taxes until you have a lower tax bracket. That's a normal IRA. A Roth IRA, you pay taxes on the money right now, but it grows tax-free with compound interest. And when you look into what that means paying taxes on roughly $150,000 and getting several $1 million tax-free later. So it's a fantastic, fantastic thing you can get into. And you can get into it with almost no money at all to start. And you just start putting a percentage of your paycheck into that mutual fund IRA. Every time you get a paycheck, put in $10, whatever it is. Put it in, put it in. When you retire, you'll retire with dignity. Anyways.
So even though that's true, we have this amazing opportunity. And by the way, we would love to stand here for the next hour and a half and talk to you about why you should begin investing and how you should be investing and how you should save. Even when you're in debt, you can actually do some things to move your wealth forward. We would love to talk about that, but that's not the point we want to talk about today. The point we want to talk about is this concept that there's this building amount of discontent in society today. In fact, social upheaval over the relative differences in wealth, especially of what they refer to as the 1% at the top, right? The super wealthy at the top. And I'm not trying to, don't want to go into, how do the wealthy actually live and what are they actually doing with that money and how much money do they actually have access to. Without going into any of that, the point is that when we look at this, there's this two-step thing that we see where there's a concept of socialism that appeals to our psychology, but turns out not to work so well. And there's this access to wealth generation that isn't leveraged and still causes a great amount of discontent, or the lack of changing our lives causes a great amount of discontent with the wealthier people in society. Right?
This is what is often known as this concept is often referred to or known as what we call class warfare, which is the foundations of Marxism, as you pointed out, Michaela. Right? We got this very class-oriented society in which Marxism was developed, which is Europe, and they come in saying not only that we want to equalize the classes, that is not what Marxism was about. It was about overthrowing the oppressors. So they saw there was this wealthy class and this poor class, and we needed to have a war. In fact, Marx did not foresee socialism being possible without bloodshed. So the idea of revolution and bloodshed and killing the upper class is baked into that cake of socialism. The idea of this gentle breeze of socialism that's slowly going to move people to a different, more enlightened and equitable existence, that is not at all what it's like. Socialism is built on the concept that there is a war between you and anyone who is relatively wealthier than you.
Right. Kirsten, you had a point?
Here. Oh, thank you. Would you think that the stock market would crash if America turned into socialism?
I don't think so.
Because I know North Korea and Cuba are socialist countries, correct? But they lack in stock exchange.
They what?
They lack in stock exchange.
Well, they don't have one because they're socialists. So if we're talking about the country going full-on socialist, there would be no stock exchange.
Yeah.
That's capitalism. I don't see America or any capitalist country going full-on socialist like that to that degree. Yeah. You're talking about the implementation of a few socialist ideas, and we're arguing about how much of it we're going to pour in. The idea that they're going to break the picture and recreate the whole country like they did in Russia, it could happen. It happened in Russia, right? It happened in basically in Venezuela. It happened in Cuba. I find it very hard to see that happening here. For a number of reasons.
But just hypothetically.
Without bloodshed.
But what's that? But
Just hypothetically, like, because the stock market is run by the government.
No. Stock market is private companies offer up
Right.
parts of their company for sale to you. That's what the stock market is. It's not run by the government. It is a private enterprise. It's regulated by the government, which is very different.
Right.
It's regulated by the government.
Did you have something, Aaron? No. Okay.
Okay.
So as we think about this and the concept of social inequity and class struggle, I have a case I want to lay out before you, and that I'd like you to think through with us today. And that is that both poverty and wealth are almost always a result of what people do. And I'd like to start out by saying the choices they make. So if I think of like the choices that poor people make, there are choices that poor people make that keep them poor. And I know that's very hard to say because it feels like you're attacking people who are living in poverty. But in fact, they are making choices every day. In fact, not doing something is making a choice. And the choices they make keep them in poverty and prevent them from becoming wealthy. Can you give me an example of some of the choices that poor people make? Yes.
Like if you drive through a really poor neighborhood, but you see like a brand new expensive, like 3 brand new expensive cars parked outside of a shack, like
having more money
in their cars than their house.
That appreciate.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, how do the wealthy do it differently?
They usually invest in real estate most of the time. Like
they're investing in something. Even if you thought of the Robinhood app that he was talking about, where you can invest in fractional shares somewhere, the wealthy look at it and they don't want to invest in anything that's going to depreciate before the investment is mature. Right? It has to appreciate in value, or they don't even consider it an investment. It's not that they won't buy a nice car. It's just when they do, they look at it and say, that is not an investment.
How many people have you heard say, maybe you've said it, but you don't have to admit to that. How many people, other people, have you heard say, when they bought a car or other things that are going to fall in value, say, that was a good investment. I'm investing in it. We're going to invest in a good car. That is not an investment. That is a poor person's choice. There's a book called The Millionaire Next Door that goes through a lot of this stuff. We don't have the time, so you should read that. He goes through and shows the difference in philosophy between the poor and the rich and what they buy, right? They buy Timexes, secondhand Toyota Corollas, and houses that will appreciate value. Like the famous philosopher of our time, Jeff Foxworthy, says, right? Your car should be on wheels, not your house, right? That's a good motto.
That's good. They also make different choices regarding sex and family, the poor and the wealthy. What are the differences in their choices?
I think that's a blanket statement. I would just like to say that. There are plenty of rich people who
what we're talking about here are statistically.
Okay.
So statistically, number one indicator that you're going to be poor is having children before you're married. Number one indicator. Statistically. Doesn't mean that every person that has a child out of wedlock is going to be poor. Doesn't mean that everyone who waits till they're married is going to be rich. But if you're putting yourself in the statistics, it is overwhelmingly the number one indicator of poverty.
Not having 2 parents in your household.
That also. Not finishing high school. These are all indicators, statistic indicators of poverty, and these are all choices you can make.
And we're not saying that you are condemned to be in poverty because your parents made a bad choice. It is, if you're hearing that, you're hearing this wrong. It's not what we mean. What we mean is, statistically speaking, people are making choices every day, and when they make these choices, those choices affect their long-term financial stability and wealth. And it's easy to point the finger at someone who made different choices and therefore had different outcomes and somehow call them evil because their outcomes were better because they made better choices.
Let me go back to an illustration you gave, Joseph. You mentioned how one farmer plants his crop, doesn't do well. Farmer right next door plants his crop and does well. So my dad was one of those farmers, and he talks about it all the time. His farms were never as productive as his neighbor's farm, and I mean his actual neighbor, because he says he was too impatient. As soon as he could get his tractor into the field, even if it wasn't really exactly the right best time, he was so impatient to get going, he went out and did it. He ended up planting in mud, which hardens the ground, and you don't get as good a crop. His neighbor, the day he thought it was time to start, he would always go fishing, take a fishing trip. Because his neighbor said, I know that if I stay here, I'll be in the field. And so he'd go fishing. And then he'd come back and plant, and he always consistently had better crops. These are choices. Most of what we look at as luck is choices. It is the consequences of many choices that cannot be precisely narrowed down and say, that was the choice I made. But you made thousands of right choices, and it'll lead normally to good consequences.
That's right. And there are other things that they do too, like the way they teach their children, the things that they teach their children, the examples they give through their life, the habits that they have in their life, and the priorities that they have when they look at time, especially the priority regarding time, right? So let's talk about those features for just a minute, right? Talk about what the poor teach their children, or the way that they teach their children, what the example they give them in their life. What's different between the way that the poor do it and the example that the wealthy give? Does anything come to your mind? Well, let's think about this for just a second.
If I may,
Yes.
I don't know how much this would fall into effect, but living by example makes a huge difference. If poor people are making choices that lead them to poverty, and rich people are making choices that lead them to wealth, and their children are just paying attention, then they are teaching their children, this is how you stay poor, this is how you become wealthy.
That's
just an
exactly
effect of
true.
how you live.
I would say that with the poor, the biggest problem is the absence of teaching. Right? You're not born intuitively knowing how to become wealthy. That's just not intuitive. Right? You have to be taught these things. And so if you're not teaching your children, or a parent isn't teaching their children, I should say, then the absence of teaching is as big a component of their poverty as anything they might have said.
That's right. That's right. The wealthy do not give frivolous gifts to their children. I find it interesting. I had a friend who was a school teacher, and he had to actually teach some students in their homes. And so he would meet the family there, and then he would work one-on-one with the student, tutor them. And he said he noticed this pattern, that when he went into the homes of the poorer students, their bedroom would be littered with every junk toy from McDonald's. Every little Happy Meal gift you could find was in their room, toy boxes full of it. But he went into the homes of the wealthy. There were a few well-chosen toys of good quality in that home, and none of that frivolous little stuff. Furthermore, the wealthy hold their children accountable for how they spend their money. But the poor often don't. They give the money to the child without holding them accountable that says, what did you get back for the money that I gave you there? What did you get back for what you spent that on? Was it worth what you got out of it? From their very habitual spending to the very big things, the wealthy simply teach their children differently.
Let's move on to priorities real quickly. And I want to just go through this very quickly, but there's a difference in priorities between the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy have a priority of later, and the poor have a priority of now. They want to buy things that work for them now. The wealthy want to look at things that work for later. The poor are interested in appearance. And again, we're speaking generalities. I'm not saying every single one of them. In generalities, the poor are more concerned about what appears, and the wealthy are more concerned about what is. Right? What appears well, a new car sitting in your driveway. What is well, a decent house in a neighborhood where the value is going to go up and not down. Okay? The poor are worried about what is carnal. The rich tend to be worried about what is spiritual, which is interesting. The poor tend to be worried about me, and the rich tend to be worried about you. Now that probably doesn't fit the way you think of poor and rich, but it is. It actually is. Now I'm not saying there's no rich person who's greedy and selfish and self-centered. Absolutely there are. But when we look at it statistically, poor people are far more selfish than rich people. Because the only way you get rich in our society without corruption is caring about other people. You do not get wealthy buying stuff for yourself. You get wealthy by providing things that other people want and need and that bring value to their life.
And I can give you an example of this. How many of you watched Undercover Boss? Right? And cried at the end of it? Right? When they... But inevitably, there's always that one employee they run into and they have to fire that person. They let them go. And why is it? Because when they were out there working with that person, they discovered that that employee did not care about the customer. And what makes that business successful is when its employees care about the customer and the experience that the customer is having with that product or service. And the point there is that the wealthy don't get wealthy by simply stepping on everybody along the way, stealing from people in order to get rich. You cannot maintain wealth long if you're abusing other people to get wealthy. The way to maintain wealth long term is to treat other people really, really good.
I think that even just goes to show in considering like the nations such as, like let's say, America versus Cuba. Like Cuba started very wealthy. And the moment people came in power and became selfish and abused that wealth, the entire country crashes. Like America, who is built on an economy of providing for its citizens, continues to stay and maintain itself because of the philosophy of how it practices work.
You're right.
That's right.
So the response, the intuitive, visceral response of those of us who have less, a lot less than other people, tends to be to resent the wealthy. Not to look at it and say, what can I learn from them? How can I model myself after them so that I can also attain to that? How can I imitate them? That does not tend to be the response. The response tends to be what we call socialism, class warfare, resentment. The Bible has a term for this. Envy. Envy. It's hating, it's resenting other people because they have more than you. It's a sin.
So
forget about the economic points of this and whether you've read enough about it to agree or disagree with us on the points we've made. Envy is a sin.
But like when that young man came to Jesus and Jesus told him, like he had kept all the commandments, and Jesus says, okay, sell everything you have. So how do you explain that? Because he did want people, and he did say that rich people have a harder time, so how do you explain he did tell people to give up everything they had to follow him?
Okay, first off, he didn't tell people to do that. He told that person to do that. Jesus encountered many wealthy people in his ministry. In fact, he was supported by wealthy people. He didn't tell anyone else that we know of. He told him that. It is very important to extrapolate that out and say that Jesus was telling everybody that. We know that because he told other people to go out and buy things. For instance, the apostles. He said, if you don't have a sword, sell your extra coat and go buy a sword. So he had obviously not told the apostles to sell everything they had. They had stuff they could sell and acquire sufficient capital to purchase other things. You understand?
Yeah, I mean,
So the question is, why did Jesus tell that individual that?
okay.
Well, that's a different topic, but that doesn't, my point is that does not overlap at all in what we're saying here. Jesus may have a commandment to you in your conscience. That is, live poor, don't invest, spend everything on the gospel. That's fine. But to extrapolate that and say that what that means is that everybody has to do that is not fine. Or to say that that needs to now be the law of the land is certainly not fine. Especially when it's coming from a point of resentment. So notice the difference here. Jesus held no resentment or envy towards that man. His command to sell everything and give to the poor was not because he resented his wealth. There was a problem in this man's heart that Jesus, the heart doctor, had determined the best medicine for it was this, and he prescribed something for him. For his sake. But when you often hear Christians rail against the filthy rich, it is not coming from a place of concern for the rich, but of resentment and envy.
That's right.
I don't know if that helps with your question. All right.
So we need to wrap this up, and we could go much longer on it. I want to summarize with a few statements here. All right. First of all, this view of the world that is infused with envy has some serious drawbacks. First of all, it's dehumanizing. That is, it doesn't really see the individuals, it sees classes. And the individuals become irrelevant, and the class becomes the most relevant thing.
It's also murderous because it's dehumanizing.
That's right.
You dehumanize this is how socialism works. You dehumanize the individual, you establish that everyone belongs to a class, a group, a category, that one category has oppressed the other, and therefore you can kill everybody in that category, right, under the guise of law, because they're oppressors. Never mind that 90% of the people there never did anything. But they are part of that group. How do we know they're part of that group? We look at their bank account. So anybody with money in the bank, you say, we don't do that. Sure we do.
Yes.
The 1%. Oh, the 1%, the 1%. If you buy a house, Michaela, you guys have a house. If you were to sell your house in 10 years, you would immediately be part of the 1%. Because you'd have all that income. You'd have this huge capital gain of a sale of a house. But you didn't live your life as part of the 1%. You were the 1% for one tax year only. But you're the 1%. And if what happened in Ukraine happened at that moment, where the socialists come into Ukraine and decide that everybody who was a successful farmer was part of that oppressor class, and they kill off 7 million kulaks, you would be with them. Because you sold a house at the wrong time.
That's right. And so I really kind of want to, there's one last point to cover, and that is that envy itself is a sin, not just because it dehumanizes and it leads to violence, but it's also faithless. It doesn't look at the Lord and say, you know what? You've promised that if there are somebody who's wealthy, who has gotten their wealth by some illegitimate means or through some manner of evil, that you would take care of them. And you would solve that problem. Often in this life, think of Bernie Madoff, right? Who mistreated all those people, and now he's in prison. And especially in this fairly just society we live in right now, where we don't want people to be mistreated, we actually judge those things. And so it turns out that envy is philosophically worthless, socially destructive, and spiritually evil, even though it is often socially respectable, but it's still socially destructive. And strangely, oddly, sometimes it's popular among the church-going, the spiritual, but in reality it's spiritually evil. Because
not,
it dehumanizes people and distrusts.
we want to be clear, what we're saying is not that all wealthy people are good people. For all I know, they're all evil people. But envying them, abhorring them because of the class they belong to, because the quantity of wealth in their pocket, is envy. And it's sin. If the wealthy are evil, as Mike said, you have to have the faith that God is going to judge that. We need to be like Joseph's brothers in their repentance from envy. I don't know if you remember the story, but they envied Joseph, right? So they sold him into slavery. He rises to the top of the nation in Egypt. His brothers fall into hunger. They come to Egypt. They don't recognize him. He recognizes them, and he starts giving them all kinds of crazy tasks, all kinds of crazy tests. What's he testing them for? Well, he starts giving the youngest, Benjamin, all the attention and all the preference. Because he wants to know, are they still governed by envy? And when it would have been Joseph, when Joseph was getting all the attention from his father, they hated Joseph. They envied him. But when Benjamin got it, their hearts had been changed by then. And when they saw Benjamin getting more food than them, more stuff than them, more attention than them, they rejoiced, it says, with him. They were happy for him. What should our response be towards anyone who acquires wealth? We should be happy for them. We should be happy for them. We shouldn't envy them. We shouldn't be angry or resentful. You should be happy that God has blessed them. And until you're able to do that, you are governed by envy. Well, we need to end there.
Thank you for being here this morning. Let's take a short break.